¿Te gustan los idiomas? ¿Te gustaría enseñar? ¿Traducir? En el barrio de Retiro se encuentra la sede del Instituto de Enseñanza Superior en Lenguas Vivas Juan Ramón Fernández, una institución pública de gestión estatal, gratuita, con más de 100 años de trayectoria. Allí se forman profesores y traductores de alemán, francés, inglés y portugués. También se dictan clases de idiomas: alemán, árabe, francés, inglés, italiano, japonés, portugués y ruso, y de español como lengua extranjera. Además, el Lenguas cuenta con un anexo en el barrio de Pompeya donde se puede cursar la carrera de profesorado de inglés. Para inscribirte debes entrar en la página del Gobierno de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires. Encontrarás toda la información referente al ingreso en la página oficial del Lenguas, cliqueando en la pestaña Ingreso Nivel Superior Marzo 2021. ¡Te esperamos!
How relevant is it for pronunciation teaching internationally? I would argue that it's not necessarily as relevant as you might first think. Let me just take a quote from Jeff Lindsay's blog, in fact. He says, "Nothing characterizes a foreign accent more than the absence of schwa. A good schwa should be a learner's highest priority in learning English." So in the first quote there, the assumption that a foreign accent is a bad thing. And in the second quote, the idea that there's such a thing as a good schwa as opposed to a bad one. What that's a value judgment, surely. Is it relevant for English language teaching? Right, so here we go. I've got my good schwa here, and I'm going to quote a line from Shakespeare's play, Hamlet, isn't it? To be or not to be? That is the question. When I teach my students about the reduced vowel in words like to, T-O, to, there we go, to with a schwa, to be or not to be, they never follow through. They always carry on saying to be, with rounded lips. Is that a problem? If I said to be or not to be, that is the question. Does it make me less intelligible? I would argue that it doesn't make me less intelligible at all. As a matter of fact, it probably makes me more intelligible. And a lot of actors, when they're on a stage, they speak in that more enunciated way, specifically to be more understood to the audience. Maybe we shouldn't sweat the schwa so much. We need it for listening, because there are a lot of people in the world who use this a lot. But for students' own production, maybe it doesn't matter. Just saying, okay, it might make you sound foreign relative to Britain or America, for example, but is that a problem? And by the way, not all native accents of English use schwa in the same way. For example, if you listen to speakers from West Africa or from India who speak English as a mother tongue, very often they will not be using a schwa where you would expect it, and it doesn't make them less intelligible. So that's just an example of where I think native models are not necessarily relevant for students who want to be understood. are we actually teaching an accent, or are we teaching the capacity to communicate? Well, let me mention a book by John Lewis here. John Lewis, he talks about intelligibility, oral communication, and the teaching of pronunciation. This is another Cambridge volume, and in that book, he says there are two paradigms in pronunciation teaching. There is the nativeness principle, and there is the intelligibility principle. Two principles which contrast with each. Nativeness is what we've been looking at so far. The idea that students are supposed to copy one of the standard English accents such as RP or General American. The idea that pronunciation teaching is the same thing as accent training or accent reduction, as they sometimes call it in the United States. Is the idea that our students should sound like they come from the United States or from Britain? Is that what we're trying to do? Make them sound as if they're from one of those places? I mean, I have to say that if it is, then we're almost doomed to failure. I was 20 years in Madrid, and I don't sound like a native of Madrid when I speak Spanish. I lived there for 20 years. I mean, I think it's a doomed enterprise. I mean, you can try, and with some students who are really determined, it might work. But not only is it doomed, it's not relevant, because, as I said before, there is nothing that is more intelligible about native accent than other accents. You can be perfectly intelligible with an Argentinian accent. So this is the other principle, the intelligibility principle. With this principle, we're teaching students in order for them to be better understood and understand others better in international communication. This principle takes into account the very fact that English is global, unlike most other languages. It's a global language, it's a global lingua franca, as Jennifer Jenkins talked about with English as a lingua franca. English is different, and it's not about your students trying to sound like they're from Britain or from the USA. It's about being better understood in the world. I'd like to talk about applications of that, the intelligibility principle, for the IPA that I'm talking about today. What are the implications of intelligibility principle for the use of IPA symbols in your classroom? Now, let me just do a case study, a big example. And it relates to this symbol here, which is sometimes called the turned V. Why? Because it looks like that turned. This is the sound, the phoneme that you hear in the word duck. I'm going to give you a sample of it by reading out a lovely poem. Here we go. Uncle Gus. Uncle Gus doesn't have much luck. His car got crushed by a 10-ton truck. He was sitting in a pub, poor old Gus, when his house got struck by a London bus. That was in my personal, that's the accent I use normally in my day-to-day life. But I am from Manchester originally, and that's one of the aspects of my accent which has been lost a little bit due to too long away from Manchester and too long teaching English. I'll just try it out in Manchester accent for you. Uncle doesn't have much luck. His car got crushed by a 10-ton truck. He was sitting in a pub, poor Uncle Gus, when his house got struck by a London bus. The vowel is actually more closed, with a bit more rounding of the mouth there. I could try it out in a London accent. It's quite different. I'll just say the title in the London accent. Uncle Gus. So Manchester, Uncle Gus. London, Uncle Gus. Interesting. It turns out that this vowel varies a lot, even within the small distances that are possible in England. In Manchester, O. In London, A. Much more open jaw. In Wales, in my accent, a bit like the Welsh one really, it's the same quality as the schwa, interestingly. As a matter of fact, it's never wise to go into a classroom and try to explain the difference between these two, because for many speakers, there is no difference except that this one is unstressed. In fact, I recommend that when you're teaching, you make that the defining feature of schwa. This is unstressed. It sounds the same as this, but it's unstressed. Let me take you to this diagram here. I'm sure you've seen this before. This represents the vowel space of the mouth, with the front. If the tongue is forward in the mouth, it's this side of it. If the tongue is back in the mouth, it's that side of it. If the jaw is more, it's at the top here. If the jaw is more open, it's at the bottom here. So you can see I put some example sounds in there. There is the schwa right there in the middle, the neutral vowel. Where is the turned V in all of this? Where should we put this? Well, the turned V in RP represents a sound about here. Central, it's a little bit more open than schwa. You may be surprised to find out this is not the phonetic place for this. If this is a phonetic symbol, it doesn't refer to that place at all. It actually refers to this place. The official phonetic position of the IPA turn V is here. The RP turn V is here. It's not the same thing. You might think that RP is the correct version, but it's got no relationship with correctness. It's arbitrary. RP, they've placed it here. They're using this symbol for something which used to be here as a phonetic symbol, and using it here. The Manchester RP, sorry, the Manchester turn V, as in duck, is up here. In other words, in the same place as the So what we've got is, oh yeah, and I said that my personal turn V, duck, is here, same place as the schwa. So that's the official one. And these are the various different accents in England. So we could draw a shape like this. This represents what that sound is. Which one is correct? None of them are correct, or all of them are correct, whichever you prefer. In other words, it's not a point, it's an area. And the fact is, in reality, in the various Englishes around the world, these symbols should not be taken to represent a specific point. They should be understood as representing an area. So instead of trying to get your students making exactly the sound that somebody makes in RP or in General American, you can just focus on making sure they make a sound which is sufficiently different from competing sounds for them to be understood. Let me just take you to this chart over here. These are the vowels on my chart here. The schwa in the middle, and then you've got the U here, the duck vowel which I've just been talking about here. One of the implications of the sounds being variable and covering an area which is more than just a point, one of the implications is that you may sometimes get conflations where two end up occupying the same space, like this. Manchester, the duck vowel, moves into the same space as the foot vowel, and these two become conflated. Oh my God, nobody's going to understand because there's no difference. That doesn't actually happen. You've got words like luck and look. They become a homophone in the Manchester accent. But there are very, very few homophones which depend on that specific difference. So we can tolerate that conflation. Meanwhile, in the south of England, the duck vowel may conflate with the hand vowel. So duck sounds like duck. So there's another different conflation. And is it a problem when two sounds get conflated? Is it a problem? Yes and no. Let me give an example that you're all familiar with from a Spanish speaker's accent of English, which is the conflation of E and I, as in ship and sheep. We're constantly trying to teach our students not to conflate those two, and that's a good thing. But they can probably, does it mean that they're not understandable if they conflate the two? Not quite sure about that. It's like this. It's like this. Think of pixels in a digital photograph. With every pixel that you lose, the picture gets a little bit less clear. It's the same with these phonemes. If every time two phonemes blend together to one, you're losing a pixel in your picture. It's not the end of the world. You can probably still be understood, but the more pixels that you lose, the less clear the picture gets. So my advice is try to get your students to make as many of the distinctions in the chart as they're able to make, but don't worry too much about each individual one, because they can probably get away with a few conflations. The idea is just to get them to make as many differences as they can. And the exact quality of the sound doesn't matter. These symbols represent, like a chess piece, a part of a system, and the idea is to distinguish between them, not the exact quality. So this represents not a sound, but whatever vowel that you use in the word duck, however you say duck, if you're an intelligible speaker of English, then that is correct. Whatever if you say duck, 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 whichever of those that you say, they're all equally good. If you're an intelligible speaker of English, that is what this is. It's your accent. It's not RP. It's your accent if you are an intelligible speaker of English. That's why I talk about symbols of empowerment. The symbol represents your accent. And let's imagine for a moment that you're a teacher of English in Argentina with an Argentinian accent. of English. You don't need to think that these symbols represent somebody else's English, somebody halfway around the world. No, they can represent your accent. Because after all, in your class, you are the best model. You can obviously use audio material with speakers from different countries, and that's a good thing for listening practice. But as a model for speaking, you are the best model yourself, and you don't need to be embarrassed about your sounds not being the same as some other person halfway around the world. That's not relevant. I did want to show you this. Now, this is a, it made me laugh. It was on the back of a van, and it just goes to prove the conflation of the schwa and the turned V. The Sofa King is from a factory which makes sofas, but they've made this joke, look, I'm Sofa King happy. I don't know if I need to explain that, but in sofa, the last sound, the second vowel there is a schwa. But the joke that this person's making is turning this phrase into a swear word. So in the swear word, it's the turned V. And the joke only works because these two sound exactly the same. I'll leave that to you. I've explained it enough already. So yes, to summarize what I've been saying then, the shape of these IPA symbols is arbitrary. One symbol represents a range of sounds. The symbols don't represent RP or General American. If you're an intelligible speaker of English, the symbols can represent your accent. The symbols are yours. Own them. These are the books that I mentioned today: Jennifer Jenkins, John Levis, Jeff Lee, John Wells, and the Handbook of the IPA. I mentioned that Stella and I will be giving a summer course about pronunciation teaching, and so that will be starting in January. If you'd like to hear more about all of this topic. And did you have something to say about this?
Thank you, Mark. I think we have a lot of interesting questions coming in. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting what you said. Really, very, very interesting. I've got some questions from some people here. One of them says, so what should we teach our students, because we need a model to help them improve their pronunciation?
Yes, and what I just said before was that in reality, you are the model, right? I mean, and you can't just choose an accent. For example, me, in my classes, I'm the model. And if the student says, but I want to learn American English, I can't just simply suddenly change my accent and sound like an American. And no teacher can do that. A teacher can only teach in their own accent, and that is going to be the model, whether you like it or not. You might as well accept that you are the model. So yes, you can use audio material. You can use a language lab with Audacity and lots of chunks of English from different speakers around the world. But that's really listening practice mainly, because most of the time the students are getting exposed to your accent. So I don't think this whole debate about which is the best model for pronunciation teaching, I don't think it's entirely relevant, because we're not admitting the basic fact that it's you that they're going to hear the most of. If you're an intelligible speaker of English, there's no reason why you shouldn't be the model. And in fact, you're going to be anyway.
Thank you. Yes. And Monica then asks, are the numbers of vowels still in use, or are they old-fashioned?
Could you repeat the question then?
Yeah, sorry. Are the numbers of vowel sounds still in use, or are they old-fashioned?
The numbers of vowel sounds.
Yeah, instead of lexical sets, the numbers of vowel sounds.
Yeah, because there are different numbers of vowel sounds. It depends how you count them, right? On the chart behind me, there are 19. On Adrian Underhill's chart, there are 20. In general American charts, there are usually, I can't remember how many, but something like 14. So fewer. If you have a Scottish accent, something like 12 vowels. So there is no correct answer to that question. It depends how you analyze the matter, one, and secondly, what accent you're talking about, two. So the chart behind me is a compromise position. I've chosen the ones that I think are useful in pronunciation teaching, but I haven't included all of the possible vowels. For example, some Adrian Underhill's chart includes the diphthong ua, which is getting less frequent. There are the difference between ua and or. Not so many speakers make a difference between those two anymore. So I just didn't think it was a particularly useful thing for students to know about. So these things are flexible.
Right. Somebody else asks, how do we measure intelligibility? How do we measure it?
Yes, there is no satisfactory answer to that either, I'm afraid. A good place to start is with Jennifer Jenkins' book, which is the phonology of English as an international language, because she attempts to go specifically to that point and she did a lot of research between speakers from different countries to work out which specific pronunciation features caused misunderstandings and which ones did not. One thing she found, for example, is that the th sounds, if they were replaced with, for example, I think, she found that this never caused an intelligibility problem. She said also that things like weak forms and schwa didn't cause, the lack of those, the lack of weak forms and schwa didn't cause intelligibility problems, which is not surprising at all to me. So she did attempt to get precisely at that question in this book. But it's also true to say that these things are evolving fast, changing. It depends more where you are in the world. I think what's intelligible in Singapore is probably different from what's intelligible in Argentina. So there's a little bit of variation in the world. And it depends on whether your listener has any familiarity with your accent. For example, if your accent has a specific feature which is not found anywhere else in the world, then it's likely to be a problem. Let me give an example. In Brazil, the speakers often change the initial R into an H. So rock and roll sounds like hock and hole. This only happens in Brazil, as far as I'm aware. And this, nobody else from elsewhere in the world is likely to have heard that before, and then it's likely to be a problem. So as a rule of thumb, the more local and specific the accent feature is, the more likely it is to be problematic in terms of intelligibility.
Right. Then Germán asks, what books do you recommend for teaching pronunciation? I mean, practical courses for students at the teaching program.
Well, it depends if you're talking about, if you actually want materials for the classroom or background knowledge for teacher development. The answer would be different for those two things. Personally, I've been writing books of materials for most of my life. The progression games that Stella mentioned, this one was 1995 that was written. Well, I say that was written in the passive voice. I should use I wrote that in 1995, published that. And I've been writing that kind of thing ever since. So for actual classroom materials, printable, photocopyable, printable, whatever, then you can use things like this, or my prawn pack books. For background information, then I recommend, for example, Adrian Underhill's Sound Foundations. You may be familiar with that. Or if you're more interested in North American models or types of English, then there is Teaching Pronunciation by, it's a big fat book. Let me just remind myself. Bye for a moment. Yes, here I am again. Yeah, that was Teaching Pronunciation by Elsie Murcia, Brinton and Goodwin. This is a great big fat tome full of great advice. Also, if you're more into the North American mode, then Judy Gilbert's classroom materials, excellent as well.
Right, then somebody asks, why is it that we discriminate some accents or types of pronunciation?
Yes, it seems that human beings are very prone to prejudice, and I suppose it's all down to something sociological about in-group, out-group. We tend to prefer people who are like us, and we tend to sometimes dislike people who are different. So I suppose that's the origin of prejudice, and accent is the perfect token of similarity and difference. You can tell from the way they speak whether somebody is one of you or something else. So it's a little bit like racism, to be honest. I think accentism is a kind of racism.
Then somebody says, sometimes in the classroom, students do not really know how to read phonemes. Would it be a good idea to model and drill specific words before you actually write down the phonemes on the board?
Well, first of all, you're assuming that you're going to use phonemes in the classroom. You don't necessarily have to use phonemes at all. It depends what kind of class you've got. If you're teaching, for example, at a faculty Philologia or something like that, and your students are learning about language rather than language, they're not learning English, but they're learning about English, then you might want to teach the entire phoneme set and as something academic. Whereas if you're teaching your students to speak English specifically, and it's not about English, it's English, then you might decide against using the phonemes, the symbols I mean, or you just use one or two which are relevant to the point that you're making. And then gradually they can build up the system over a number of weeks. So I certainly wouldn't assume that my students are ever going to need to write these things. As a teacher, or if you're doing teacher training, you probably do need to learn to use these things productively to be able to write them. But for your students, for most students, I wouldn't say that that's a necessity. So I will limit it to receptive use and introduce just the ones that are relevant to the pronunciation point that you're working on that day. And then maybe as a kind of at the end of the year or something, then you could look at the entire system, the entire chart. So.
Right. Sometimes in sorry, Mark said something about teachers being the best accent model for the students. What does he tell his students when they want to learn, for example, American English? Should they change teacher? What happens with non-native English teachers?
It's a funny thing that students don't necessarily know what they want. Yeah. And so I like to give this example from Gemma, a friend and a colleague in Glasgow. She did some research and asked the students, and these are students who are studying in Glasgow, Scotland. She asked them, do you want to learn Scottish pronunciation or RP? I should mention, by the way, that Gemma has a Scottish accent. And they said, we want to learn RP. We want to speak RP like you. In other words, they thought that a teacher, Gemma, had an RP accent, when in fact she didn't. So they didn't know what they were asking for. So there's a certain amount of you've got to assume that a lot of students are not very they haven't given a lot of thought. The commonsensical thing when you're learning languages, everybody who is not in the business of English teaching, is not in the business of linguistics, if you ask them about accents, and maybe let's say they were learning Italian, they'd say, I want to sound like an Italian, of course. When you ask them, why are you studying Italian? I want to sound like an Italian. This is the commonsensical street idea. But what you need to somehow communicate to your students is that the point is not sound like an Italian. It's not going to happen. The point is to be understood in Italian. So your students need to understand that the accent doesn't actually make them better understood. If they were to speak with an American accent, that does not make them more intelligible. So if they insist, then you could just tell them that you've got you could say, I speak an American accent. You could tell them that. That would be lying, of course. You could, but if they really insist, and if you haven't got this American accent, you can use tapes, you can use videos, you can use all of that, but you can't change your accent. Your students are just going to have to leave your class or accept your accent. And yes, you can help them by using audio material, etc. But you can't change your accent, can you?
No. Well, I think that there are a lot of questions, but I think that...
yes, we have so many questions. Yes, Virginia, and we are running out of time. So we are definitely encouraging you all to contact us, and if you didn't get your question answered, and we will contact you, or I'm sure Mark will be very happy to hear from you also. Once again, thank you very much, Mark. It's been an extraordinary experience, and also having you all here today. So now Daniel Ferreira Fernandez would like to say thank you as well to all the participants and to Mark especially.
Yeah, thank you, Stella. Thank you, Mark, very much. Very interesting listening to you. Empowerment is not power. I like that very much. Right? Talk, right? So thank you for being with us today. Thank you, everybody, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you some other time. Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Monica and Mark. Thank you in particular. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye. Give a big round of applause to Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming along today. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.
Well, thank you, Virginia, for curating the questions. Thank you, Estela, for being here. Monica, thank you. Take care.
A pleasure. You too. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.